Chapter 6. The Origin of the Halliwell Poem. All these facts concerning the gradual changes in the religious character of the institution, which by a collation of the old manuscripts we are enabled to derive from the legend of the craft, are corroborated by contemporaneous historical documents, as will be hereafter seen, and thus the legend, notwithstanding the many absurdities and anachronisms which deface it, becomes really valuable as an historical document. But this is not all. In comparing the Halliwell poem with the later manuscripts, we not only find unmistakable internal evidence that they have a different origin, but we learn what that origin is. The Halliwell poem comes to us from the stonemasons of Germany. It is not, perhaps, an exact copy of any hitherto undiscovered German document, but its author must have been greatly imbued with the peculiar thoughts and principles of the German Steinmetzen of the Middle Ages. The proof of this is very palpable to anyone who will carefully read the Halliwell poem and compare its idea, the rise and progress of geometry, with that exhibited in the later manuscript constitutions. These latter trace the science, as it is always called, from Lamech to Nimrod, who found or invented the craft of Masonry at the building of the Tower of Babel, and then to Euclid, who established it in Egypt, whence it was brought by the Israelites into Judea, and there again established by David and Solomon at the building of the temple. Thence, by a wonderful anachronism, it was brought into France by one Namus Graecus, who had been a workman at the temple, and who organized the science in France under the auspices of Charles Martel. From France it was carried to England in the time of St. Alban. After a long interruption in consequence of the Danish and Saxon wars, it finally took permanent root at York, where Prince Edwin called an assembly and gave the Masons their charges under the authority of a charter granted by King Athelstan. It will be observed that nowhere in this later legend is there any reference to Germany as a country in which Masonry existed. On the contrary, the Masonry of England is supposed to have been derived from France, and due honor is paid to Charles Martel as the founder of the order in that kingdom. Hence, we may rationally conclude that the legend of the craft was modified by the influence of the French Masons, who, as history informs us, were brought over into England at an early period. In this respect, authentic history and the legend coincide, and the one corroborates the other. Different from all this is the legend of the Halliwell poem, the internal evidence clearly showing a Germanic origin, or at least a Germanic influence. The Reverend Brother Woodford objects to this view because he says the legend was then common to both countries. But with all due respect, I cannot but look upon this argument as a sort of petitio principii. The very question to be determined is whether this community of belief, if it existed at that time, did not owe its origin to an importation from Germany. It is certain that in none of the later English manuscripts is there any allusion to the four-crowned martyrs, who were the recognized patrons of German operative Masonry. The variations of the Halliwell poem from the later manuscripts are as follows. It omits all reference to Lamech and his sons, but passing rapidly over the events at the Tower of Babel, the building of which it ascribes to Nebuchadnezzar. It begins, if we accept a few lines interpolated in the middle of the poem with the legend of Euclid and the establishment of Masonry by him in Egypt. There is no mention of King Solomon's temple, whereas the history of the building of that edifice as a Masonic labor constitutes an important part of all the later manuscripts. The legend of the four crowned martyrs, concerning whom all the later manuscripts are silent, is given at some length, and they are described as good masons as on earth shall go. These were the tutelar saints of the German operative masons of the Middle Ages, but there is no evidence that they were ever adopted as such by the English Brotherhood. There is no allusion in the Halliwell poem to Charles Martel, and to the account of the introduction of Masonry into England from France during his reign, which forms a prominent part of all the later manuscripts. Neither is there any notice of the Masonry in England during the time of St. Alban. The poem attributes its entrance into that country to King Athelstan. Lastly, while the later manuscripts record the calling of the assembly at the city of York by Prince Edwin, Halliwell makes no mention of York as the place where the assembly was called, nor of Edwin as presiding over it. This fact demolishes the theory of Dr. Oliver that the Halliwell poem is a copy of the so-called Old York constitutions. From all these considerations, I think that we are justified in assigning to the Halliwell poem and to the other later manuscripts two different sources. The former is of Germanic and the latter of French origin. They agree, however, in a general resemblance, diversified only in the details. This suggests the idea of a common belief upon which, as a foundation, two different structures have been erected.